We talked about him on yesterday's show, and now we've got some news. It looks like Kentucky basketball is now the front runner to land North Florida transfer Chaz Lanier.
You are Locked On Kentucky, your daily podcast on the Kentucky Wildcats, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, what's going on, Big Blue Nation? Welcome on into Locked On Kentucky, your daily Kentucky Wildcats podcast. I'm your host, Lance Dawe. On today's episode of Locked On Kentucky, we are going to be discussing Chaz Lanier. We talked about him on yesterday's show, and now it looks like the Kentucky Wildcats are in a great position to potentially land him here sometime soon. Also on today's episode, a four-star prospect has decommitted from the South Carolina Gamecocks, in-state prospect for the Kentucky Wildcats. Will they be able to land Trent Noah as well? We end up in Lexington. Going to talk about him on today's episode, and then to round out the show, going to take a look at the roster. If hypothetically Kentucky was able to land both of these players, what would the roster look like? And is there anything else Kentucky needs to do? Thank you so much for making Locked On Kentucky your first listen every single day. Want to remind everyone out there that we are free and available on all platforms. And if you are watching on YouTube, I would greatly appreciate it if you subscribed to the show. And if you are listening on podcast, I would appreciate it if you subscribed there as well. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can make every moment more, and right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. You can visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. Kentucky basketball may very well be close to landing Chaz Lanier, the North Florida transfer. We talked about him on yesterday's show. One of the most efficient players in the country. One of the most efficient shooting guards in the entire nation. Actually, statistically, if I'm not mistaken, he was the most efficient player in college basketball just a season ago. Excellent scorer, and that's what Kentucky basketball needs. That's the final thing that they kind of need to add here to their roster. If you take a look at Lanier's numbers from a season ago, 6'4", 180-pound guard, 19.7 points per game while shooting 51% from the floor, 44% from three, and 88% from the charity stripe. All excellent shooting splits while averaging 4.8 rebounds, 1.8 assists, and 0.9 steals per game. Chaz Lanier, again, I think would be the perfect addition to this team. We've already talked about him quite a bit on the show. Yesterday, we dedicated half an episode to him about how I thought he was one of these best players, not just available on the board right now for Kentucky, but also one of the best players available specifically for what Kentucky basketball wants to do with the rest of their roster. Because as we know, we talked about this also on yesterday's episode. We talked about the fact that Lanier is just kind of fits that mold of what Kentucky is kind of waiting for as far as that final bucket getter, that final scorer that Kentucky needs to add to their roster. Because if you look up and down this thing, and we'll look up and down it here later on in the show, Kentucky doesn't have that specific bucket getter. And that is what Lanier is out here to do. Now, it's really awesome that he has a pretty decent assist rate and gets some rebounds as well. But here's why we're talking about him again today. Kentucky is the front runner, according to reports. Take a look at what Matt Norlander of CBS Sports said on a recent podcast on his Eye on the College Basketball podcast. He said North Florida's Chaz Lanier, who's not a big-time name, but he's being sought after by big schools, and it's looking like it might be Kentucky. And if it's not Kentucky, it's Tennessee. And if it's not Tennessee, it might be BYU. Lanier is considered the 8th best player in the portal to enter their name this offseason, according to On3. And I think that all things considered, not only is he a very highly ranked player, but he is also perfect. There's nothing really else to say here. There's nothing much else to say about Lanier other than that. I think he would be absolutely perfect for what Kentucky wants to do. Apparently, according to some rumors, Kentucky's had multiple Zoom calls with him, one of them being extremely long. I can't speak to the accuracy of that. It's just something that I've seen online, not confirmed by any national outlets. But the thing about Lanier is the efficiency, right? You saw the shooting splits. 44% from three is awesome. 51% from the floor is really, really good, especially for a guard. But if you take a closer look at where he's shooting specifically in different spots on the floor, you'll start to become even more impressed. He shot 66% at the rim last season. That's great for a guard. That was 31% of his field goal attempts. He shot 55% on left break threes. That was about a quarter of his field goal attempts, and that's borderline unheard of. That's very, very good. 36% on right break threes. That's really, really solid. That's 3% above the national college basketball average, and 39% on left corner threes, which is 6% above the average. So beyond the arc, the man is hitting at a blistering hot clip to kind of average out to that 44% we talked about earlier, on top of a 12% assist rate. The man can pass the ball a little bit, and I think he would work very well with what Kentucky currently has in their backcourt. Kirk Risa, Lamont Butler, two guys that can kind of spray the ball around. I think Travis Perry will get involved here as well. Those are three guys that I think could really, really help Lanier in his scoring. And it's not necessarily like Lanier needs help scoring, but it's an added bonus as well. The interesting thing about North Florida and the Ospreys a season ago is that they loved to shoot threes. Lanier was technically their best shooter. He was one of their best percentage shooters, and then he was also one of their best volume shooters a season ago. And the thing about the Ospreys, again, is if you look at their numbers on KenPom, they were number one in the nation, and three-point dependency is the word I want to use here, but it really is just the percentage of points that they got from three was higher than anybody else in the nation. They relied on the outside shot to get their points more than anyone. And Lanier was a huge part of that. Now, how deep into the three-point shot are we going to get with Mark Pope this season? Well, I'm not quite sure. I know we're going to have tempo. I know we're going to take a lot of threes. But if you go actually and look at some of Mark Pope's numbers outside of his first and last seasons with the Cougars, it's not as a heavy dependency on the three-point shot as we would like to think. And that's another episode for another time. But Lanier, I think, will fit in. Kentucky needs a score. They need another shooting guard. They need somebody that can go out there and get a bucket from all sorts of places. He fits the mold. Kentucky's the front runner. We'll see what Tennessee and BYU do. I'm super excited about it. Let me know what you think about it in the comments below. Will Kentucky basketball land Chaz Lanier out of North Florida? You can also hit me on the socials at Locked On UK on Twitter. All right, we got a 4-star prospect over in the South Carolina Gamecocks, but he has decommitted from South Carolina and Lamont Paris, and he is looking to maybe play a little closer to home. Can Kentucky basketball land him? Well, they're already projected to. Let's talk about Trent Noah in just a second. Before we do that, though, I want to tell you guys about our friends over at FanDuel. It's a winner-take-all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own, because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more, so you can visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. That is FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, continuing along here on the Tuesday edition of Locked On Kentucky. Lance Dawe hanging out here with you. Really appreciate you checking out the show today. If you have not subscribed to the show already, I would greatly appreciate it if you did so, whether that be on YouTube or on podcast. Just want to remind you guys, if you have not checked out the Locked On Kentucky Discord, I would also appreciate it if you did that as well. Link is in the description, just a place to go and chat with fellow members of Big Blue Nation. So we've talked about Chaz Lanier, how good he is, and just how important he could be to Kentucky's roster on yesterday's show and on today's episode. Let's talk about a 4-star prospect that I think also really does fit Kentucky's program very well. Trent Noah, a 6'6", 200-pound shooting guard, small forward out of Harlan County High School in Baxter, Kentucky. He was originally committed to the South Carolina Gamecocks, did so, I believe, back in November. At least he signed his letter of intent to the Gamecocks back in November. And he decommitted today, May 7th, 2024. Here's what he had to say on Twitter with the caption Proverbs 16:9. He said, quote, "To begin, I would like to express my gratitude to the South Carolina basketball staff and fan base for embracing me as a Gamecock. After much thought, prayer, and extensive conversation with my family, I requested and was granted a release from my National Letter of Intent, NLI, with the University of South Carolina. I will be reopening my recruitment with hopes of pursuing basketball opportunities closer to home. I sincerely appreciate Coach Paris's genuine investment in me, both on and off the court, and his compassion and professionalism during this process. Please respect my decision. Thank you. You heard that right there. He wants to play somewhere closer to home. The kid from Harlan County High School in Kentucky. At this point, I'd be surprised if he doesn't end up a Wildcat. I mean, you go and look on 24/7 Sports today. He's already received a crystal ball projection to come commit to Mark Pope and the Cats. And I think, again, he fits very well in this system. Take a look at what 24/7 Sports has to say about him. Adam Finkelstein, director of recruiting, he said, Trent Noah is a strong-bodied wing and an elite shooter off of the basketball. His game is based on the three-point line. He's not only one of the best in the class when it comes to making spot-up shots, and thus providing gravity as a floor spacer, something that Kentucky will love in the future with Pope, but also capable of making shots on the move. He's a heady offensive player and a good passer who knows how to play within offensive structure. Noah has a strong and fairly broad frame, which can allow him to defend some bigger players. He also is a solid wing rebounder. He needs to continue to work on his defensive quickness and his ability to create his own offense. Again, he averaged 20 points per game as a freshman for Baxter, Kentucky, out of Harlan County. He hit 60 of 143 three-pointers, being named honorable mention All-State. And then as a junior, Noah averaged 26.5 points per game and scored a total of 821 points during the course of the season. And then also just a fun little tidbit here. He has 3,707 points to his name during his high school career, which is unofficially the fifth most all-time in Kentucky basketball high school history. The kid's a baller. And he's also a pretty highly rated 4-star at that. 105th nationally, according to the 24/7 Sports composite ratings, number 25 small forward, and number 2 player in the state of Kentucky. Again, I would be surprised if this kid does not end up becoming a Wildcat. And I think, again, a lot of this has to do with the fact that I think he fits just so well with what Mark Pope wants to do. And I don't necessarily think, if you look at that scouting report, I don't necessarily think Noah would have to do a bunch of different things, creating his own shot and maybe becoming a quicker defender, which are a couple of different knocks against him. I don't think he's going to have to do anything like serious in year one because of just how much, crazy to say it, kind of like depth Kentucky is building up in the backcourt through the portal this offseason. I think it would be next year when you really start to see Noah become more involved with the rotation and be an important piece for Pope within his kind of 5-out, 4-out, 1-in, up-tempo, three-point shooting offensive system. Now, you'll have to pair him, I think, to start with some really good passing point guards, which I think Kentucky has a couple in Butler and Carissa. And actually, no, they've got 3, including Travis Perry, another Kentucky high school product. So I think Noah would be fine. I think it would be an excellent addition just as far as stereotype for what this offensive system wants to do. Again, I think he needs to improve on his defensive quickness, not necessarily his speed getting up and down the court, just quickness as far as reaction to various things on that end of the floor, which I'm pretty confident Kentucky staff can coach him into. Trent Noah, would love to have you come on down, be a Wildcat. We'll see what happens. He's already, again, received a crystal ball, so we'll see if Kentucky's able to get him. All right, let's round out the show today talking about what the lineup would look like if Kentucky, hypothetically, just for fun here, let's say Kentucky gets both Lanier and Noah. What would that look like for Kentucky basketball? We'll talk about that in just a second. Before I do that, though, I want to tell you guys about our friends over at Monopoly Go. We got to pause here to talk a little bit about Monopoly Go, and I know what you're saying. We've already talked about it quite a bit, but there's just so many fun different things to talk about in this game. In Monopoly Go, we've talked a lot about the competitive side of things against your friends, but you can team up with your friends, actually, for timed tournaments where you can work together to build up each other's boards. There's so much to win together, and there's so many different awesome prizes to unlock. So much more to get on top of that, like unique stickers, cool new playing pieces to travel the boards with, and then hilarious emojis to taunt your friends whenever you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every single day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go. So get off the bench and go download it now free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on with Monopoly Go. All right, wrapping up the Tuesday edition of Locked On Kentucky. Lance Dawe hanging out here with you. Let's talk for a second about this roster. Let's talk about the roster if Chaz Lanier and Trent Noah were to commit to Kentucky. I'm going to start here at the top, work my way down. We're going to talk a ton about this during the offseason, about what we think the starting lineup will look like, what the rotation will look like. I want to be very clear here as we begin things. And I've said this on a show recently, and I'll say it again. Lamont Butler, I believe, is going to start at point. That is my prediction. That is my projection. Lamont Butler will be the starting point guard for the Kentucky Wildcats for the 2024-25 season. Kerr Kriisa, the transfer from West Virginia, I think will come off the bench behind him. There's a world where Kriisa starts at the 2. There's a world where he even starts at the 1. But I believe what's more likely is Butler starts at the 1, somebody else starts at the 2, Kriisa comes off the bench. Maybe you could start Kriisa at the 2 because of just how good of a three-point shooter he is, and then you could kind of have them kind of work back and forth with ball handling duties because, again, Kriisa, I think, is the best passer on this team right now. Travis Perry, I think, is the guy that's kind of third string here, quote-unquote, to come off the bench behind Butler and Kriisa. I think Perry could also get a little bit of run at shooting guard. Speaking of shooting guard, Chaz Lanier. If Kentucky gets him, I think he's the starter at the 2, no questions asked. Colin Chandler, the 4-star prospect. I think also Perry could work here as well. And then Trent Noah, if you want to, you can play him at the 2 in certain rotations, but I think Noah will work more primarily behind Kobe Brea and Otega Dawe out of Dayton and Oklahoma. I think Brea will get the start at the 3. And I think Dawe will come off the bench. Again, Noah, I think, can rotate in here a little bit as well. Could you see Colin Chandler slide down? Maybe, if you really wanted to get funky with it. And I think Kentucky, because of how many different wings that they have that can actually shoot the basketball, you can really put out some more. You can put out some bigger bodied lineups and then some smaller lineups as well. Kentucky's got some very interesting players to work with. So many different rotations I think that you can do just on paper. We'll have to see how this team actually operates with each other. And maybe it's a little bit more restrictive than I anticipate it being by position, I should say. But Butler, Lanier, Brea, I think they're your 3 starters from the 1 to the 3. At the 4, until Kentucky picks up a guy like Chor, Jackson Robinson, who have you, I think that Andrew Carr is going to be your starter at that power forward spot. Solid at Wake Forest, good outside shooter, really good rebounder, good rim protector. There's nobody else really to challenge him for this position because he's the most power forward-like player on the roster. He played the most at power forward at Wake. There's not really anything to argue here. I think it makes the most sense unless you get somebody like Robinson, at which point I think Kentucky does end up going with Robinson to start because I find it hard to believe. I know Robinson came off the bench at BYU. I know he was the 6th man. I get that. I find it hard to believe that Robinson's going to want to come off the bench again to finish out his collegiate career as somebody who's a potential NBA draft pick. That's just me. I don't think we should normalize that because of what happened at with Kentucky and Coach Cal. I don't think you should normalize having draft picks come off your bench. Especially if you don't have them in the starting lineup. That's just my 2 cents. I don't think that's crazy. We saw that this last year. And then to wrap up at the 5, I think Amari Williams will start over Brandon Garrison. I think this makes sense as well. Williams, the more experienced player, I think right now just has more under his arsenal. I think overall it's just like the defensive prospect that Kentucky needs out there guarding the paint with a decent amount of minutes to throw at as well. But Garrison, I've talked about this over and over and over and over again, raved on the show about just how good I think Brandon Garrison can be in the future for the Wildcats. I think he can be excellent, flat out. I think he can be really, really good, the former McDonald's All-American. So that's my starting lineup. That is my bench, just to give you it one more time. Butler, Lanier, Brea, Carr, and Williams, if they do get Lanier. And then the bench. Kerr Kriisa, Travis Perry, Colin Chandler, Trent Noah, Otega Dawe, and Brandon Garrison. Let me know what you think about that in the comments below. You can also hit me on the socials at Locked On UK. And that's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Kentucky. Hey, you can follow the show on Twitter at Locked On UK. You can follow me on Twitter at LanceDawe_. And you can follow the show over on Instagram. That is at Kentucky Podcast. Any questions, comments, concerns, leave those in the YouTube comments below. Hit me on the socials. I will see you all tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Kentucky. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day. And God bless.